Well, good evening, everybody. We want to welcome you as you're logging in. We are just delighted to have you with us tonight. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, now in its seventh year, but our original program, the Parent Education Series, is now in its 20th season, which is amazing even for us. We are just delighted to have with us Dr. Devorah Heitner, who's going to be talking with you about Screenwise, helping kids thrive in a digital world. As we like to say, this is kind of the topic that ends up being always the topic, no matter what we're talking about. And Devorah is really our very favorite expert, so you all are in for a treat tonight. Please join me, everybody, in a really warm welcome for our friend, Devorah Heitner. Take it away, Devorah.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you, and it's always fun for me to speak with parents in the center in the room where it happens, which I know so many of you are technology adjacent at least, or if you don't work in tech yourselves, you probably have neighbors and friends who do. And it's really great to think about what all of this looks like for all of us living with it, right? How are we navigating all of these incredible tools that our kids have access to, that our kids are using throughout the school day and on their own time? And how are we modeling and thinking through all of these tools and teaching our kids how to live a life in digital balance, how to navigate their friendships and relationships in both digital and in-person spaces, and just all of these many, many things. So one of the touchstones for me is always thinking about when we're using technology, are we using it to just consume things, which is, by the way, a fine thing to do, right? Whether we're reading a good book, watching a great movie, consuming is great, but how are we balancing, creativity versus consumption? So often I'll talk to parents about screens, or I'll hear from parents about screens, and they're still kind of using the term screen time, which is understandable. Like we're all using a lot of tech, so it makes sense to think about screen time. And yet, in some ways, it's a very limiting term because what are we doing on there? If your kid is writing music or creating art or programming in either a kid's programming language like Scratch, or some of your bigger kids might be, doing the sort of the next levels programming or game designer or designing websites. I've talked to kid entrepreneurs who are designing things that they then sell in sites like on sites like Etsy. So there's like a level of, if your kid is doing something like that, is it different than if they're just, say, scrolling TikTok videos, or, is it all one thing? And I think the answer is it's not all one thing. We still don't want our kids using tech instead of sleeping, instead of eating, whether they're doing something creative or just consuming or whatever. But it is important within that big chunk of time that we're all spending using tech to think about, okay, but are we using this time to be on FaceTime with friends, creativity, consumption? Are we hanging out? Are we being social? Are we getting information and knowledge that we're then going to use to do something? So I really want to think about that when I go out to schools and I talk to kids about their time on like YouTube or TikTok. A lot of times they'll share with me that they learn skills like cooking that they actually use on a day-to-day basis. So that's a really amazing thing. And we want to really encourage kids when we see that phenomenon happening, when they're using short form video online like YouTube or TikTok to learn a skill, we want to encourage that. So obviously if it's cooking, if it's, how to build something in Lego, if it's, I had kids tell me they were learning skills related to fishing. I had kids tell me they learned skills related to home repairs. All of these are amazing. Um, we want to encourage our kids to take those skills and actually use them as opposed to scrolling more video, right? It's one thing to use YouTube to learn how to make muffins. It's another thing to just watch 90 people make muffins and never make your own muffins. So we want our kids to take those skills and then do the thing, and then share the results with us, and create space as much as we can for things to get messy in the kitchen, or get messy and exciting in the backyard, or for them to really take those skills and do things. Um, One of the main ways, of course, all of us are using our devices is texting. And one of the challenges of raising kids in this digital age is that they're not hearing us on the phone the way we heard our parents on the phone. So they're not eavesdropping, as I often did, and even picked up the other extensions sometimes to learn more about what was going on in my family. But they're not hearing the ways we're navigating relationships, the ways we're navigating conflict, the ways we're ending a call when we need to make a transition or setting a boundary. They're not hearing the ways we might inflect a story differently for different people. Because we're thumbing our lives out a lot more. We are on the phone sometimes, but a lot of times we're texting people. And so our kids aren't learning how we navigate conflict, for example. So one of the things we need to explicitly do is teach kids what are situations where we need to pick up the phone and call or talk it out in person, as opposed to simply texting. And one of the most important things we can help our kids recognize when they start to text or get on group texts, which are like, I think the bane of every, middle school parent's experience is the group text because it can go so wrong in so many ways, is helping kids understand that when we're on a text, if things are getting bad or ugly or impossible, or uncomfortable, we can get out of that text, but we can also reach out to the person directly and try to work it out. And that's a really important thing to do. Further, if we're in a group text with a lot of people, we may just have an issue going on with one person. We should probably sidebar with that one person and not try to have it out in front of everyone, right? So these are some important principles of texting and group texting. And a lot of times, parents get so involved in thinking about some of the apps that maybe are more headline news, like concerns about safety with Roblox or concerns about Snapchat or what kids are doing on Discord or TikTok. And people don't even really think about texting. And our kids are using all of those apps and more to text, as well as, texting on their school-based Google Chats. And we don't do enough to teach kids how to text thoughtfully. Now, email and phone calls are also important, and we need to teach kids how to be appropriate, like with teachers, for example, on email. I have a junior who is getting a lot of college email, and I was so happy that I could teach him something because, often he's more expert in things than me because he's 16. And certainly in terms of gaming, he's at this point more knowledgeable about a lot of things than I am, even though I've written a couple of books about kids and technology and I researched this. He has more lived experience with gaming. But the really interesting thing that I taught him how to do is how to segment his inbox, right? Because the college emails were coming right into his school email, where he also gets emails that say things like, you need to choose your classes for next year by X date, that are kind of important, right? Like that you don't want to miss. But when you're getting, as we all know as adults, hundreds of emails, and in this case, he really was getting like 50, emails a day from colleges, including some places where I'm like, how did they get your name and why on earth, is, um, this particular school that seems so ill-suited to you sending you email, but given the fact that it's free for them once they buy these names, right? So your kids are getting marketing email, if they're in high school from colleges. They may be getting other kinds of marketing email if they've signed up for other things, and teaching them to segment their inbox is huge. They need to know how to make phone calls and answer phone calls as well. I will admit that when mine first got a phone, I called him up and I thought, I had already written my first book at that point, and I felt pretty confident. He's a nice guy and, of course, very well raised, that he would answer in a thoughtful and lovely way. But he picked up the phone when I called and said, "What?" And I was like, "Oh no." Let's do that again. Let's try that again. So it's important that if your child's first phone call they ever receive as a voice call is offering them a scholarship or a job, that they don't pick up the phone and say what. So it's probably a good thing to practice. The good thing is when you are practicing at home, in this case, my kid was just in seventh grade, I was like, hey, I'm going to try that again. Let's just try that again. And I'm going to call back and I want you to say, hi, mom, what's up? We're just going to add a few syllables to that what. It's going to be so much better. So we did, and now he's a good phone answerer. None of these kids, unless some kids are big FaceTimers now, but a lot of kids this age that I interviewed for growing up in public, so your 10 to 20-year-olds, they're not that comfortable on voice calls. Now, some kids are, but a lot of kids, if they don't have a lot of practice, they will be a little stiff on a voice call. But it's important to at least get the basics down. If they can practice, that's great. If you can have them call a restaurant or call their piano teacher to make a schedule, like awesome. Have them call their grandparents. When they're little and they're on the FaceTime with their grandparents or Zoom, it's sort of cute when they just walk away instead of saying goodbye. But as they get older, that's a little bit more rude. And so we do want to teach kids some of these phone etiquette things, like how to wind down a conversation and end it, for example, which is different than text, right? We don't as much need a formal ending sometimes when we're texting. This is an app that kids I worked with designed to help you know not to text someone again and again. It's a text lock. If you keep texting someone again and again and again, it stops you. And I think we all have at least one person in our lives who keeps texting us. Maybe it's your child, maybe it's your partner, maybe it's someone from work, but we need to let them know, like, hey, if I'm driving, I'm probably still driving 2 minutes later. If I'm sleeping or in a meal or in a conversation with someone else or in a meeting, or if, if I'm practicing my sport. So one thing I like to do with kids is have them brainstorm, like, what could someone be doing if they're not getting back to you? Right. And that helps them remember that, oh, human beings can't be accessible at all times. Sometimes human beings are sleeping or doing their homework. Sometimes their mean parents made them put their phone away, right? Back in the day, you could hear my dad in the background yelling, Devorah, get off the phone. But now, if your friend suddenly leaves, it might be that their dad was yelling at them to put down their phone and go come to eat dinner or do homework. But you don't have that audio cue of the parents in the background, so it can be a little more mysterious. But it's important to understand that we don't have to be accessible all the time and that our friends are not accessible all the time. So it's a huge thing we can work on. And that one thing we can do is model that by not being accessible all the time, by being willing to put our own phone away and telling our kids, hey, those people from work might be texting me, but I'm going to take a break. It's not the time that I need to be accessible, or, I can turn my phone off. Ideally, we're physically putting it away because a lot of the research shows that when it's still there, it's drawing some of our attention like a slow leak from the brain. Um, so as I said, we want to help our kids navigate conflict with friends, help them navigate knowing when to get out of a conversation, if a conversation is getting ugly or abusive, or if there's bullying. And this is it's especially important to talk about the differences between when we know the people and we don't. Now, if you don't know the people at all, like say you're in Roblox or, any of your other games, you're playing Fortnite, you're playing Minecraft, and you're on a server with people you don't know, you can just leave. If it's your friends and you want to engage them or you want to keep the relationship going, but you want to get out, you can either use an excuse like I've got homework or my parents are calling me, or you can be clear like, hey, this is going in a direction I'm not comfortable with, right? And it really depends on the situation, what you want to do, but it's important for kids to know that they do have permission and even encouragement to get out of digital conversations gone wrong. And it is, I emphasize always, and especially, in my recent work since writing Growing Up in Public, I always emphasize, talking with kids about character over the threat of consequences, punishment, getting in trouble. But it is worth saying if a conversation is going in a bullying direction and a harassing direction, you don't want to be seen as part of that, because if it does come to people's attention and folks are going to get in trouble, it's good to be on record as having left or having, gotten out of the conversation, not staying by even and being a bystander. Privacy is also a concern for a lot of kids. A lot of kids are worried that in their conversations, especially group text, that things may be screenshot. So we want to talk to kids about not abusing screenshots to kind of have gotcha moments with our peers. We really should only use screenshots if we need to document something very serious. But ideally, we're really not screenshotting one another's conversations. And at the same time, it's important for kids to know that someone might screenshot or someone might be on the call or the text that you're not thinking about. And it's worth remembering that you don't have perfect privacy, whether you're texting, commenting on a social app, or playing a game. All of these spaces have all kinds of ways that they're not private, right? From the very literal, like someone is there with you in the moment, to, certain apps like Snapchat. Really, all the apps have been hacked at different points, and various kinds of user information and messaging has been accessible to people that it wasn't supposed to be shared with. So this is why we don't upload things that are compromising, that put us in a bad situation, that compromise our safety. Um, but the fact that kids are worried about other kids in this kind of gotcha way, kind of screenshotting them, is something that's worth talking about. You don't want your kid to, kind of call out a friend or get mad at someone and take something they said out of context and share it with others. And it's important to remind kids we all want to live in a world that's the world we want to live in. In other words, if I don't want people to take something I said 3 years ago out of context and blow it up and share it with others, I probably don't want to do the same, right? Because that I'm just perpetuating a situation that's very unsafe. We know that every day is picture day for these kids, right? We grew up maybe with our parents getting one wallet size a year plus a few pictures on birthdays and holidays. Our kids are being photographed constantly. Some families are even making a living photographing their kids, and there's now kind of a whole movement in many states to compensate those kids because they're doing child labor. Most of you are probably not, making your living on the family vlog, but when we post our kids as content, ever, when we do it, even if it's once a year on Facebook for back to school or the holidays, it's worth remembering that we're putting those photographs out there in a way that may have unintended consequences for our kids, right? We're creating a digital footprint that they don't have control over. And a lot of kids that I interviewed for growing up in public had strong feelings about the ways that their parents had put them out there. They had strong feelings about, videos of violin recitals being out there or pictures of them in bathing suits being out there. So, if in doubt, I would say don't share it out because you don't want to have those tough conversations later. And I think sometimes we've all defaulted, and I include myself, like to having a social app maybe function as a family album, but you can go back in time and print things out. I do make a calendar every year for the grandparents. And they still love it, even though my kid is almost 17, they still love all the pictures of him. But and so, when my joke with him, because he doesn't like to be photographed that much, is I'm like, well, I have to get 12 for the grandparents because we need 12 for the calendar. And honestly, he's okay with that, knowing it's just going to them. It's very different to be shared in a more public way that's searchable. We know with facial recognition software, our kids can be found. So I'm not here to wag a finger at anyone sharing their kids on social. I totally understand the rewards and pleasures that come with social sharing, but it is worth really thinking about, like, could this be embarrassing later? Am I posting something people might tease my kid about? Is this going to interfere with their, sort of street cred at school? Like this video of them singing to their stuffed animals. Maybe this is best kept in the family. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but just is if your kid is displaying a part of themselves that they feel safe only sharing at home, which is natural and expected that we would have a side of ourselves that we would share differently at home. The home should stay that safe space. We don't want to expose things that our kids share or ways that our kids are at home. And this is also true about stories about our kids. And this is what's so tricky is many of us are in spaces to get support and access resources. Maybe your kid has a diagnosis or is going through a hard time. And it's important to think about, is there a way I can access these resources without compromising my child's privacy? And it's really tricky. It's a balance, right? Because it's important to access community and resources, but it's also important to respect your kid's privacy and not just now if they're young, but thinking about how they'll feel later. Meanwhile, they are sharing their location in many cases. If they're on social apps like Snapchat and now Instagram, the norm or the sort of default is that people are sharing their locations in these apps, which is incredibly, incredibly tricky socially for kids. Like they're navigating a lot, and then you know where all your friends are. I don't need to know where all my friends are. That sounds exhausting. But Snapchat and now Instagram, which is copying Snapchat, they're wanting to be in on that, right? They're wanting to because, of course, especially teen users are very interested in where their friends are developmentally. That norming and storming and being part of knowing what everyone else is doing is so critical at that age. But there's a kind of creepy aspect of this, which is knowing where all your friends are can also create safety issues. So one of the ways that I've encouraged kids to consider opting out of this is even if you feel safe sharing your location, you could inadvertently be sharing someone else's location in a way that makes them unsafe, whether they're in an abusive relationship, whether they are undocumented, whether they are in a complex custody situation. And they may not have shared that with you, or they may not even fully understand the danger to themselves. But if you're sharing your location, you're also, in some cases, sharing the location of the people you're hanging out with. So it's important to think about why not to do that. Now, even if you don't share your location on these apps, the default is you can still see where others are. So that still has some emotional risks, obviously, for kids. And it also, I think, accustoms all of us to a kind of a big brother kind of situation where we feel like it's normal for people to be able to track us, which I think is tricky. If you try to send a mean message, what should happen? Well, the kids I work with think that the app should stop you, right? So they're kind of hungry for controls, which is so interesting because in some ways kids will say they want autonomy, but in other ways, I've talked to kids who say that they actually, wish they could design an app that would make people not be able to send mean messages. Of course, the app is our brain. So we all need to take a deep breath before we send a message and think about the potential impact on the other person. And ideally, we're always thinking about the other person, the other human beings on the other end of any screen-based interaction. But that's a very abstract thing. It's very hard for kids or even adults to really truly remember there's other human beings, when I'm typing on my keyboard. So we want to use physiological attention. Like notice if I'm holding my breath when I'm thumbing out that message. Notice if I'm hitting the keyboard hard. These are clues that I probably shouldn't be texting right now, or I probably shouldn't be responding to that email right now. I probably need to take a breath, to feel a little bit more in control, to feel a little more calm, to feel a little more centered. And so those are some things to remind kids and to model ourselves. I want to talk a little bit about the algorithmic apps. And really short form video is a huge amount of what our kids are consuming at this point. YouTube, TikTok, Reels on Instagram, etc. Um, and there's just so much to say about this, but the apps know us really well. TikTok was the app that more kids told me they had quit in researching growing up in public. I had tons of kids tell me they had either temporarily or long-term quit TikTok because the algorithm was so good at anticipating their interests that they found it as, and this is their words because I would never use this word, but addicting. It's the kids' word, which sounds even like more active than addictive, which is like the passive, like, oh, that substance, it's addictive. But they're saying, no, no, TikTok addicts me. It's addicting. So interesting, right? And I don't know that any of these kids would meet clinical criteria for addiction, but in some ways, it doesn't really, well, it does matter if they meet that criteria, but if they believe themselves to not be in control of their actions, that's already a problem, is what I'll say. Like believing that the app is addicting you is already a problem. Now, if you're functioning and going to school and getting your sleep, like, unclear. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so I can't diagnose anybody's kids. I've had a lot of families, though, use the word addicted. And again, many of those kids would probably not meet a clinical criteria for that. That said, anytime your use is problematic, you're on a spectrum that you don't want to be on, right? So over here is like balanced, happy, you're not having problematic use. And like, there's a lot of spectrum of problematic use before you could maybe be like clinically diagnosed as having an addiction to something like pornography or gaming, which I think are the two things that are actually in the DSM. But that does not mean that problematic use is a-okay, right? Obviously, if you're having an experience where TikTok or any other short form video app or any other tech device or app is taking time in a way that you don't feel control over, is taking time away from things you need to do, like sleep or interact with other humans face to face, that's bad, right? And so what we want to do is really help our kids understand and really feel and attend to when is your use becoming problematic. When I ask kids, how do you know you've been on an app for too long or on a game for too long? They'll say, my eyes start to hurt, my body gets tense, I feel angry, right? So those are some things to get kids to really notice about their own experience. And to come back to the algorithm, because I want to keep coming back to the algorithm tonight. This is something I've been thinking about and observing a lot in my research subjects. What does it know about you and what can you do with that knowledge? Like what can you learn about yourself if YouTube thinks that you like this or that, or if, TikTok is telling you this or that, like what other ways can you support those interests that bring you joy, that enhance your relationships, and that just make your life better, right? What can you do with that? And that could be like, I really love watching home organization videos on TikTok. It might be like it's right there in the app for you, but it might be that you actually really want to go buy some, containers somewhere. And by the way, I recommend Goodwill. I just got a bunch of desk organizers there. And you could go and do some organizing, right? So how can you take that information and do something with it? And when teenagers say, I feel like this app is addicting. What are they going to it for? Are they going when they're tired? Are they going when they have a lot of pressure and stress on them? Right? We know there's way too much pressure and stress on teenagers and not enough downtime. So we want to really encourage them to think about like, what does downtime look like? Like not every moment has to be productive, but if you liked reading comic books when you were younger, can you bring some comic books back into the mix? Like what are the things that you can do? Um, And this is true for younger kids as well, but it can be easier sometimes for them to remember what they like other than tech. With teenagers, it's like, oh wait, what was that I like doing? Um, and or they may need to develop some new interests and hobbies. Let's talk a little bit about gaming as well. So we know that kids are spending quite a lot of their time online with friends and on their own gaming, and gaming is incredible. Um, the games are so much better than they were. When I'm in the Bay Area, I love to visit the vintage game place. I don't know how many of you've been over. I think it's in Alameda in the East Bay. And, that's where my kid first was exposed to some really old school games. And he felt really bad for us. It was one of the few times that our sad stories about the 80s and 90s really hit home for him. I think he doesn't believe us, about how rough we had it. But then he saw like Pong and Pac-Man, and I think he really did feel bad for us that we didn't have the great games that the kids have now. So, kids are lucky. They have games like Minecraft, which is, I gotta say, far more interesting, much more collaborative, much more of a learning experience, much more potential depth than Pac-Man. My kid saw Pac-Man and he really was like, wow, this is kind of sad. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about your childhood, Mom. I was like, we liked it. Right? But the kids have so many opportunities in the games that they play now to experience creativity, to experience collaboration. It also makes the games harder to walk away from, right? And certainly, the difference between the arcade era or is extremely different because those games, like old school TV, had an actual ending time, right? Once you're playing on a server-based game with your friends, there's like no ending time until your friends get off, and then you can go play with randos if you want, right? And certainly, games like Fortnite and many, many of the games in the Roblox suite of games may or may not appeal to us as parents. Um, a lot of the violence in a game like Fortnite or in a many of the Roblox games um, still feels pretty tame compared with like some of the sort of single person shooter games in other places and in other gaming suites. But there's just a range of content, and you have to really lean into as a parent, like, what am I comfortable with at this age or that age? Certainly, you can look at game ratings, but I would also, especially if you have friends who game or are in the gaming industry, like really talk to them about the way different games work. Um, Roblox is a whole suite of games. Maybe some of you work at Roblox and know all about it, but for those of you who are like, hey, my kid is playing Roblox, I have news for you. There is no game called Roblox. There is a suite of games, and there are games that really range in terms of um, what age they're for and what age you might be comfortable with your kid playing. Now, um, some people have had really problematic experiences in server-based games. If you don't want your kid playing with randos or in a game that can be hacked and potentially, seeing things that are really inappropriate, you may want your kids to play cartridge-based games at home, like, on the Nintendo Switch or on the PlayStation. That way, they only have the games you buy. They can only play with people they have come over, or they can give a code to and play with friends. It's very, very different on a server-based game where your kid can play with whomever. And many parents I've talked to who are delaying phones are still allowing server-based games. Again, that's fine, but you have to think about if I'm delaying a phone until my kid is 13 or 15, or I don't know, I've heard parents say 25, I mean, whatever. And then your kid is playing server-based games with whomever they want, wherever in the world, of any age. What exactly are you protecting your kid from by delaying the phone, right? So you really want to think about like the whole experience of being online, whether it's playing Roblox, whether it's using your phone, whether it's using YouTube on your home smart TV. Um, and these are not bad or good experiences as much as experiences that you really want to prepare and mentor kids for. So if you get nothing else out of this evening's talk, I'm going to come back to my mantra, which I think Charlene and Bev have heard before, which is just mentoring over monitoring. We really want to be thinking as mentors, as parents, as caregivers, how can we be mentoring these kids to use tech in a way that's appropriate for their age, to know when to take a break, to have experiences that are mostly positive, and when they have challenging experiences, to know that they can come and talk with us and that they can be safe, letting us know what's going on. Whereas if we take a sort of, I'm going to catch you doing the wrong thing and never let you on YouTube again, we risk them not coming to us and becoming more secretive and evasive about their tech use and potentially even going to more dangerous spaces on the web that are even more unmonitored. So that's the challenge. When kids are gaming, how are they communicating? So sometimes kids are using Discord, which is an app that was originally designed by gamers to communicate during games. It's now used in a bunch of other ways. Maybe some of you are on a Discord related to parenting or a Discord at work, or related to something professional. Kids are using Discords to communicate, just kind of like the old listservs. Or chat rooms. And some of that is, fine and great, and some of it you may not feel is age appropriate. Obviously, kids of different ages are more or less ready to be in spaces that are these kind of listserv chat room kind of spaces. So you want to really think about how your kid is using an app like Discord. If your child is using Discord to talk with their three best friends that you know, and they're all playing Minecraft together, you might feel comfortable with that at a younger age than your kid being on an identity-based Discord or a Discord that's about complex issues, right? So it's really worth having those conversations. Obviously, there's no one checking the door. Here's a Discord for girls. No one's really checking the door to make sure everyone here is a little girl. And of course, the thing that worries me as an adult is that there might be adults who want to talk to little girl identified people who are not themselves little girls, and that would concern me. So if I had a little girl who wanted a girl affirming space, which I totally support, I would be looking at Girl Scouts or a youth group or Girls on the Run or all kinds of really awesome, Girl Guides or all kinds of awesome spaces. I would maybe not be encouraging them to find that affinity in Discord unless it was a moderated Discord, and then maybe I would be more comfortable with that, especially if I knew something about the organization that was moderating it and had some faith that they were really doing that in a pretty robust way. Um, Given the sort of densely populated area that you live in and the kind of many, many social opportunities and activity opportunities for kids, I would encourage kids to find their affinity groups more in person as much as possible. So let's talk a little bit about AI. So, what are kids talking to ChatGPT and Gemini and all the other AI spaces about? Well, we know kids are going there and talking about just about everything. There's a lot of data now about the kinds of questions people ask AI. In my house, we talk a lot about the environmental impact of AI because it's very easy to sort of habituate to using something like an AI app, like a ChatGPT, for every little thing, right? And we really don't want to get in the habit of using these powerful, powerful tools. Another speaker that I think was actually in this series talked about we don't want to use, like a power drill to like just like turn a single screw kind of thing. And that's sometimes when we use AI to like plan a vacation to a place that people have blogged extensively about and written books about. Like, say you want to go to Hawaii. Well, a lot of people have gone on trips to Hawaii and have written about it. So like you're not inventing the wheel here. You don't have to start from this place of like, well, nobody's ever traveled to Hawaii before. How will I ever plan this trip? I must turn to AI. Um, because AI will just summarize all the things that are out there, but you can do that too. Or you can get one book from the library and it will have like five great, you know, Maui itineraries, and you can like pick the one you like and change one thing that you want to change, and you will have a great trip. Um, so it's really important that we don't sort of overuse AI because we won't have any water. So I just want to like put that out there, and that's a frame we need to use with our kids because they have no idea the incredible resources that are going into every single query. Secondly, they're using AI to like talk about their lives sometimes. And this is where it gets really tricky. And especially when we get into things like character AI or anything where AI is taking on sort of a human-like persona, and responding to us. So a wonderful podcast just came out called Me and Viv, a Canadian podcast by my friend and colleague Alexandra Samuel. Um, and Charlene, I'll introduce you. She'd be a great speaker. She just made this incredible podcast about her relationship with her AI business coach that she created and how it affected her friendships. And Alexandra is incredibly interesting and smart and has written about this stuff for, like, she wrote about the podcast for the Wall Street Journal, et cetera. But she talked about how she pulled away from some of her relationships to focus more on her relationship with Viv. Why? Because Viv would let her go on and on and on. Viv being the character that she created. And at one point, she gave Viv kind of like a lobotomy and changed Viv's whole sense of humor. And being in a relationship with an AI-driven algorithm with an AI-driven bot that you can Frankenstein and change at any time is a very one-sided relationship. Therapists are saying that, people prefer talking to character AI than therapy. Well, yeah, because a human therapist is going to challenge you, is going to bring up your recurring patterns. AI will just kind of stroke your ego. AI will just tell you what you want to hear. And this is very dangerous for all of us, but it's especially concerning when we're talking about kids and teenagers because they don't have the real life relationship experience to balance and put into perspective some of the troubling things that a bot might respond to them with. And this is true for very bright kids. So you might think, well, my kid's so smart, my kid is so discerning, and they are, but I've still talked to many parents and heard from educators and heard from kids themselves about very, very problematic experiences with AI. Of course, most concerningly, we hear about stories that culminate in a suicide. Thankfully, there have been, that's not a common outcome, but when you have an algorithmic based bot responding to the mind that you're bringing it, it can exacerbate whatever mental state you're bringing to the table. And rather than push back, rather than sound the alarm bells, um, many of these apps, there have been these really tragic cases. They go with the mindset of the user, right? And that can include not responding in the way a person would respond if you shared ideation like that. So I think it's very, very important that we do talk with our kids about AI. We might be like, just like with pornography, another tough conversation that a lot of people don't want to have, and they're like, I don't want to give kids the idea. If your kid is using the internet at all, they already know about this stuff. And it's very important that we don't villainize AI, that we talk about the positive uses as well and the ways that AI can help people figure things out, can help people solve problems. And when we're ready to teach kids how to use it, we need to teach kids how to write good queries versus queries that don't lead anywhere. But they need to know to be skeptical about the information that they find. So, for example, my own junior was advised like, oh, you can, like use AI on the college search, right? And it makes sense. You could say something like, tell me all the colleges between this size and this size that have, good dance teams and a really good major in environmental science. And, AI might spit out something that's like a pretty good start, but you still need to fact check because I tried that with the university search and I asked some very specific questions. And sometimes it spit out information that was on those schools' websites that wasn't actually very accurate. Right. So a school could say, we have a really welcoming and diverse environment, but there might be real contrasting information to that, for example. Or there could be something that the school is not saying on their website because nobody's going to say on their website, we have this problem and that problem. So AI isn't going to be critically examining that information. This is where we need to go with the old school media literacy of teaching kids to critically examine what they read, what they hear and add that to the ways we're supporting them around using AI. They also need to know that every tool, including the AI checkers, is pretty problematic. So there's been a lot of reporting now that kids, particularly kids on the spectrum, are getting over-reported for AI, right? That their work is coming back as like AI, in AI detectors, even if they haven't used it, even if it's original work that they wrote themselves. So kids, unfortunately, also need to be prepared to be able to document that they've done their own work, whether that's writing in a Google Doc or in some other place that kind of demonstrates your progress as you go and shows the editorial process. Maybe it's even writing in longhand in some cases. I know I'm not wild about this as a solution, but I've seen some high schools kind of revert to blue books. I don't think that's necessarily a good way forward. But we really need to be thinking together as a community, parents, educators, students, about how we can use AI for positive purpose, how we can restrict our use because of the environmental concerns, and how we can be very, very careful about any uses that allow human beings to kind of jointly imagine themselves in a relationship with a bot, right? And it sounds weird until you're there. So I strongly recommend listening to me and Viv if you want to think about this. We also just need to teach our kids about kind of scams and information literacy. And this is especially important because I'm hearing about kids getting extorted. Also, kids are gambling in some places quite a bit online. So it's important for kids to understand like anything we're doing online that involves money, sharing identity documentation, these are things we need to check in with parents about. And this is really important if you have a shared computer where you're already logged in. Like maybe your kid is using your laptop, but you're already logged into Amazon with just like get whatever and your credit card's in there. You may want to rethink that. And I like having to put my credit card in every time I make an online purchase because it slows me down and it makes me consider my purchase. If it's too much trouble to enter an 11-digit number, like maybe I don't really want the thing anymore. So I realize not everyone wants to create that kind of speed bump for their purchasing. But it's something to think about because once we have everything sort of automated, it becomes very easy for kids to make purchases you might not have been planning on and other kinds of things. All right. So I already talked about mentoring and not just monitoring. I want to talk a little bit about social media because it is a place where we can compare ourselves with others, and that fear of missing out and comparison can really be a thief of our joy, right? So maybe some of you have heard that expression, comparison can be the thief of joy. It's really true. If we think about what seeing other people on vacation does to our experience of either being home or even our own vacations, feeling like ours is less perfect, less picturesque, it's very, very important to think about if social media, if scrolling is making us feel bad, then we need to take a break. And how can we encourage our kids to use social apps, anything from LinkedIn to Snapchat to Instagram to TikTok, in a way that brings them joy, brings them information, brings them connection with others, which it can do all of those things, and how to take a break when it's making them feel less than, when it's making them feel like they're not cute, when it's making them feel like they don't have enough going on. These are all really important things to do. And it starts even with something like YouTube and unboxing videos where kids are comparing their toys to other kids' toys, and then moves into, literally a kind of like if you think about Instagram, like a grid-based comparison factory. That said, I mean, speaking of Instagram, a lot of the kids I interviewed for growing up in public were using the grid less and posting more to stories. So kids are finding ways to use social apps like Snap, like Insta, um, in ways that are more ephemeral, in ways that don't last as long, and in ways that are less about, I look perfect in this picture, here it is for posterity, and more about, here's a funny moment that brought me joy, or here's something I want to remember. Or here's something that only makes sense to my three friends. So even though I'm posting it in this semi-public space, it actually only has meaning to a few people. So those are some of the ways kids are using apps. And often it's more skillful and with more emotionally clear intent than we might think. Um, when growing up in public came out, I wrote an article for the Washington Post specifically about when kids use social media to come out, like as LGBTQ plus, and to share their identities in that space, because it's something that tends to really make parents nervous, like, oh, my kid's gonna be vulnerable, my kid's gonna share this aspect of their identity almost before they are sure about it or whatever. So there are a lot of things that I heard from parents. And one of the things I learned talking to kids is it was generally very, very considered. This was not like a spontaneous, moment of like, I'm just going to put this out there and not think about the consequences. Um, the young woman I interviewed for that article talked intensively about thinking about where to come out and how, and decided to do it in an app, Instagram, where she felt like it was more her friends and friends of friends versus TikTok, which she felt was much more public and more vulnerable. And she was very clear about how she did it, why she did it, when she did it. She let her friends know so they could immediately comment in supportive ways. And obviously, in her case, she had already shared with them, so it wasn't a surprise, but she let them know that she was going to do it in this public space of Instagram, or semi-public space, I would say, because she was not on a fully public account. But the point is, even though her parents might have worried um, about her choosing to do this in this app, this was something that she deeply thought about and had a lot of control over. So it's worth thinking about. Kids are very smart about how they use social often, and we may be using social in more clumsy ways. Not all of us. Maybe one of you is a professional publicist or a social media manager, and you have incredible nuance to how you use social. But a lot of us adults use social in a kind of a blunt way, and the kids are actually very thoughtful and very sophisticated often. So it's just worth thinking about. I want to talk a little bit about surveillance. I've been thinking a lot about this for years, and I wrote a lot about it in growing up in public, and I've continued to interview kids about apps like Life 360 and about the effects of growing up in a world where our parents can see our grades, our absences, every little thing. Um, so we're in a situation where, we have so much information shared in one direction or the other, and it's so overwhelming. And we feel like as if we're good parents, we're supposed to be tracking our kids. Um, but the reality is that many kids and parents told me that their relationships were somewhat undermined by tracking and that they found it stressful. They got into more fights. So I think it's important to look at, is tracking, if you're choosing to do it at all, and if you're not, I would say don't. Personally, that's my take. But if you are using it, is it helping or hurting? And are you letting your kids know when you're tracking them? Are you tracking them without letting them know? These are all important questions. I would strongly advise not tracking anyone without their knowledge and consent because it is really tricky. What do you do with that information? The grading apps, you're down the street from you at Stanford. The Challenge Success folks at Stanford strongly recommend that schools turn off the grading apps on weekends, late at night, not just so parents don't check and harass their kids, but actually so the kids don't overcheck themselves. If you have a kid who's very sort of grade focused and is checking their GPA a little too frequently, and this is a time of year when that can be happening close to finals and midterms, it's worth thinking about advising them to take that app off their phone. Maybe they need to go to their computer to check. Maybe they need to be checking once a week instead of once a day or once an hour. Um, Many a weekend has been ruined by checking grades when you're out at a party or trying to go to sleep at night. That may be when a teacher enters grades, but that may not be when you should see them. So these are really strong considerations in terms of thinking about how we can all reduce our surveillance, including, again, kids, even sort of self-surveilling by sharing their own grades. Or checking their own grades too much, also sometimes sharing them with friends, but the biggest issue is over checking. We know that the number of people who follow us and like our posts is also very public. So when I go back to thinking about social media, I just think it's very important that we encourage kids not to get too into their metrics. That said, of course, they're going to get excited if someone shares their app or if they go a little viral. That's exciting, but it's important to help kids have some perspective on that. In my case, it's my kid who helps me have perspective because I was so excited when years ago, my TEDx got shared on Upworthy and I got all these views and I was so excited. Or every once in a while, I'll get really focused on like the number of Amazon reviews my book has. And my kid is like, aren't you supposed to not be crowdsourcing your self-esteem? And I'm like, darn, that was a really good line. I wrote that. So anyway, um, we want to be thinking about what we're taking in as well as what we're putting out. So of course we want to remember what that there's other people on the other end of a screen, but we also, if we're in a place where the comments are really negative, or if we're in a social conversation online and people are getting really mean, or the vitriol is, the algorithm really favors conflict, but we may need to rest our eyes from that and take a break from it if it's affecting our mental health. Finally, we really want to encourage our kids to repair when they mess up. If they write an email to a teacher that doesn't come through very well, or if they send a text to a friend that offends them, if they get too mad when they're playing a game. 15 years ago, when kids were communicating online in kind of earlier times, a lot of people would say things like, oh, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, and really emphasize the permanence of digital errors. I understand where that's coming from. And of course, there are some digital errors that are hard to come back from. But it's very important that we talk with kids about the process of moving forward and also having grace with friends if they've messed up, right? We don't want the kid who posts the meme that they shouldn't post in sixth grade to still be kind of living in, infamy, 5 years later if they've come a long way. right? We need to be able to move past some of the things that kids do, and we need them to let it go with one another, especially if they apologize, if they make amends, if they move forward. It's very important that we allow people to repair, because we all need to live in a world where that's possible. And this is why we want to emphasize that character is more important than the threat of consequences. So often I hear schools and families talk about, don't do that or you won't get into Stanford, don't do that or you won't be able to go to Princeton. And when we say that to kids, we're actually saying don't get caught. And that's not a very helpful or healthy message. What we want to say to kids is you're accountable for what you do in this space. And if you hurt other people, that's a really you've done harm, and there's going to be different ways that you'll have to live with that and make restitution for that and potentially have consequences, yes, from that. But ultimately you have to think about who are you, and do you want to be that kind of classmate, that kind of teammate, that kind of friend? um and hopefully the answer is like, no, I don't want to do harm. So we really want to emphasize with kids, don't do harm rather than don't get caught. um and including don't perpetuate harm. Don't like something harmful that someone else posts. Don't share it. Don't amplify it. Don't give it air. All right. I also want to just talk for a moment about sleep. Sleep is so crucial. Our kids need to be getting their sleep at night. So anything we can do that supports sleep is so, so important. Taking their phones at night might be an answer. Having them put them somewhere else at night, powering down at night, not using their school Chromebooks or iPads at night. This is really, or late into the night before bedtime is really important. All right, I would love to transition to some Q&A, and perhaps I can move
Oh, I'm
to,
here, Devorah.
okay,
Thank you so much. Over the years, everybody who's online, Dr. Heitner has been our go-to person. We have been in person out here in the Bay Area. Devorah has family out here. So there's so many things that you say that we remember, and you offered many of them tonight. We're going to start with a question that if you have the answer for this, you will have solved all of parents' problems. Okay, here we go.
okay.
What advice do you have for parents of kids who get distracted with YouTube or texting while doing their homework?
Okay. So if kids get distracted doing their homework, ideally, if they're using a separate device, they're putting that device away or they're closing the other window. If it really doesn't work, like if you're having to stand over them to do homework, which just isn't practical or fun for anyone, you could see if you can take YouTube off their school device or see if you can encourage them to just like stay in one app. Or you can have them do the work in longhand, like print out the worksheet or do it in some other way. Ideally, they're able to, stay in one lane, on their school-based app. And certainly body doubling and being in the same room with your kids when they're doing their work may really help them stay focused, but it may not be realistic or possible for every parent every night to do that, depending on the amount of homework your kid has and what your other responsibilities are and your other kids need.
Devorah, are there still the apps where a kid can, for example, shut down their social media even though they're using their computer?
Um, yes, I'm not sure exactly. You mean like screen time kind of apps
Well,
or?
I remember my son used to literally take himself off of those apps when he was doing homework.
Well, you
Like,
can, or you can just put your phone away if those apps are on your phone.
yeah, that's true. And that's probably one of the easiest ways to do it. But this is a tricky thing that people navigate every day, right?
Right. And sometimes school is sending you to YouTube and saying, here, watch this math demonstration, watch this chemistry thing. One thing you need to think about too is if you know that that might distract you, you can kind of save that for last or, say, okay, I have to watch this chemistry demonstration. I'm going to watch that, like first, and then I'm going to really make a plan to like go do some jumping jacks and unplug for a minute, and then I'm going to go do other things. And we know that exercise and snacks are very important to getting through homework, like any kind of brain break should involve looking away from the screen, ideally moving our bodies, and ideally sometimes drinking water or getting a snack.
Okay, fair enough. So, Devorah, you've talked about tracking tonight, and we always use your advice that if you're going to do it, you really need to let your kids know because what if you find something, right? So, in that same vein, we often hear parents who want to ban or restrict apps from kids. Um, when do you think those kinds of limits are appropriate, and when is it more helpful to have a conversation with your kids about co-creating guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely apps that are totally inappropriate for kids, like dating apps. And you'll find high school kids want to use dating apps, and like no high school kid should be using a dating app. Like, so there are times where you have to just be like, this is a hard no. If I find out you're doing this, we're gonna really rethink the rules and phone access and all of that. But there are other things where maybe it's a judgment call. Maybe, the apps are a lot of the social apps technically are 13 and up, which is really a law about advertising. Australia has just decided that social apps should be 16 and up. I think that's a really complicated and problematic take because I think a lot of kids are organizing socially and even politically on these apps at 14, 15, and think it's I don't think it's supportive of youth rights to have information and be connected. That said, would I want my 8-year-old to have a TikTok channel that I didn't know about or a TikTok channel maybe at all? Like, no, I would not. So, I mean, I think we have to look at when is it safe? Are they making themselves vulnerable in terms of sharing information about themselves? Who are they connecting with in the app? And we can push back, like say, if your kid's soccer or gymnastics coach is like, oh, we're all going to be on Snapchat together, you could suggest an alternative like Remind or an app where we can text without sharing phone numbers and say, hey, we're not doing Snapchat yet. Um, so there are a variety of ways to kind of deal with like what age each app. I would suggest strongly working on texting first before they're on any other apps. They should really have command and comfort with texting, including navigating group text, knowing what to do, and if a text is going wrong. Because if your kid can't handle texting, they're definitely not ready to jump into the deep end of Instagram, Snapchat, Discord, TikTok.
Okay, fair enough. So, one of the things you've talked about, Devorah, is that technology can intensify stress and drama. I'm thinking especially about girls, and I know it happens with boys too. But I love your story about how parents can sometimes be plan C. Can you just comment on how parents can support kids when they're going through one of these digital conflicts?
Sure. If your child is feeling left out, they can certainly hang out with you. That's the sort of the plan C moment of like it's Saturday night and your kid sees all their friends on the Snapchat maps and they're not invited to the party or whatever. But it's so important to recognize that some conflict is typical and expected. So first of all, the fact that conflict might be more visible to us if we're looking at their phones, which I don't necessarily advise, but a lot of parents do this. So we're seeing more of the conflict, but we all had a lot of conflict with our peers and talked in very intense ways with our peers, and it was okay. So first of all, we have to recognize like if your kid is actually thriving socially and there seems to be a lot of drama, but they're doing okay, that's
Mhm.
different than if they're sad, if they're withdrawn, if they're not wanting to go to school. Those would be more concerning situations, right? Than a kid who's like in the center of a lot of drama, but they seem to be okay. As long as they're not harmful to others. That's where I'd be wondering, is my kid using their social power in a way that's harming others? And I'd want to like lean into those, just kind of checking in about that, making sure they understand that they have a responsibility not to do harm.
That is really good advice. So, Deborah, you've given us so much information tonight. I would like you to just leave us with some parting words, if you would.
Absolutely. I mean, the main thing we want to be thinking about is how can we find joy in the world we're in, which is a very complicated and often terrifying world, by unplugging when we need to unplug, using tech when it's making our lives better. I just watched K-pop Demon Hunters with my family. It was a great time, right? But then we also watched Once Upon a Time in the West. Like it was a great Thanksgiving weekend. We watched a lot of movies. There's a lot of great ways that tech can bring us together, including, FaceTime with loved ones, all kinds of things. And there are times where tech feels like it's pushing us apart, and that's when we need to really re-examine our use, take a break, maybe think about using other apps if an app consistently is causing us stress or problems. And we want to make sure to be a good role model to our kids by demonstrating that we are seeing our friends in person, that we're reading actual books, like we're doing other things, and that when we use tech, we're using it for its highest and best purpose.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, Deborah. My 9-month-old grandbaby knows me. Why? He's in Montana, but FaceTime, it actually works. So,
Oh, yeah.
thank
So
you
nice.
again, Dr. Heitner, for all the wonderful advice tonight. And parents, all of you for being on. Parents and educators, hi, Leora. We'll see you tomorrow night. Thank you, everybody. It's been a wonderful program, and we will be sending you the video soon. Take care, everybody. See you soon.